In today's game, Alireza Firouzja goes up against one of the great players in the history of Russian chess, Grandmaster Peter Svidler. This is a battle of 2700s. Peter Svidler was 2714, Alireza Firouzja 2759. This is the Paris Blitz of 2021. Let's begin. Alireza has the white pieces. Peter Svidler has black. Alireza begins with e4. Peter Svidler responds with e5. And Alireza plays knight to c3, the Vienna opening. Knight f6, bishop to c4, knight c6, d3. A lot of the times for white, the main idea here is to play the pawn break f4. Bishop to b4. Peter Svidler pins the knight at c3. And Firouzja goes ahead and decides to go ahead and play knight f3 and not play f4 right away. It's a little early. Svidler plays d5, which is the best scoring move in the position, opening things up, liberating his c8 bishop, and black is probably equalized at this point. Pawn takes, knight takes. The safe move for Firouzja in this position would just be to play bishop to d2 to protect this knight at c3. Instead, he castles, which is a bit of a tricky opening. Svidler takes the knight at c3, pawn takes, and Svidler has given up the two-bishop advantage, but as compensation, he's damaged Firouzja's pawn structure, and he's got a little bit more space with the e5 pawn. Now, you may notice that the knight at c3 is hanging. Svidler does not take that pawn. Instead, he castles. Well, what if he does take it? After knight c3, queen to e1, and Firouzja hits the e5 pawn, he hits the knight at c3, and after knight to d5, yes, he could take the e5 pawn, and he would be in good shape, but even stronger would be this move, bishop to a3, taking away black's right to castle kingside because this bishop controls the f8 square. That would be an extremely annoying piece. So Firouzja gambits the pawn, and Svidler says, no thanks, I don't want that pawn. Rook to e1, hits the e5 pawn, bishop g4, pins the knight, and now knight takes c3 would be strong. So Firouzja goes ahead and defends it with bishop to d2, rook to e8 to defend the e5 pawn, h3, asking the bishop, what are you going to do? Are you going to take my knight, or are you going to retreat? If he does take the knight, that would not be the best move. After queen f3, Firouzja would be hitting the d5 knight. He would gain a tempo, have the bishops, and that wouldn't be very good for black. So Svidler instead retreats the bishop with bishop to h5, maintaining the pin. Queen to e2 continues to put pressure on the e5 pawn. Also, the queen might be able to go to e4 to remove the pin. Queen to d6 defends the e5 pawn. Rook a to b1 puts the rook on the half-open file, threatens the b7 pawn. The knight goes to b6 to block that threat. He's also threatening knight takes bishop at c4, which would eliminate the two-bishop advantage and triple Firouzja's pawn, so he's not going to allow that. Bishop goes to b3. Now queen to f6. Svidler is threatening to take on f3 with his bishop, and now he would wreck the kingside pawns for Firouzja, and Firouzja would have pawn weaknesses all over the board. So Firouzja plays g4, an aggressive move. The problem with it, of course, is that he's moving pawns in front of his king, and that puts his king at a bit of a risk, but as we know, well, that's one of Firouzja's signatures. He's willing to put his king in a little bit of danger, calculate his way out of it in order to get a strategic advantage in another area of the board. So he gains space, but his king, of course, is a little bit more open here. Bishop to g6 and knight to g5. The idea with knight to g5, of course, he can come back to e4, but he's also threatening f4, which would be crushing as Svidler does nothing about it. The pawn on f4, first of all, he couldn't retake the pawn because queen takes e8 would be mate in two. It'd be a back rank mate. He would also be threatening f5, trapping the bishop at h7. So f4 is a serious threat. Svidler has to do something about it. He plays h6. That gives his king some luft on the back rank and also kicks the knight back in front of the e-file. The knight at e4 hits black's queen, and the queen can move to any of these squares, h4, e7, d8, and that probably was the best choice. But instead, Svidler takes the knight at e4. Bishop takes e4, queen takes e4. And when we look at this position, notice the minor pieces. The two bishops are strong here, but Svidler's knights have nowhere to go. I mean, they're just sitting there on c6 and b6, and they have very little future. So Firouzja, I think, has definitely won the battle up to this point and has an advantage. Svidler plays the knight to d7. What he's threatening to do is play knight to c5, fork the queen and bishop, and remove that bishop advantage. Bishop to d5 avoids that threat. Queen to d6, Svidler sets up another threat. Knight to f6, which would fork the queen and bishop and win the bishop because the queen also would be attacking it. Firouzja sidesteps that threat. Rook takes b7, knight f6 would win the minor piece. Firouzja sidesteps that threat, and he threatens bishop to f7 check. He is not threatening rook to b7 just yet. The way Svidler handled this, the threat against f7 and b7, was to play knight to d8. But that overloads this knight. The knight does defend both squares from the d8 point, but the better move is probably rook to e7. The reason is b7 is poisoned, because after rook takes b7, knight to a5 forks the rook and the queen. But here, after bishop to g2, Firouzja is still definitely in better shape. But Svidler plays knight to d8, bishop takes b7. Firouzja gets his material from his positional advantage. He has to give up the bishops, but now he's got material. Rook takes b7, and here come a series of threats. First of all, he's threatening to take the c7 pawn, so Svidler defends it. Bishop e3, now he's threatening to take the a7 pawn. Svidler plays knight to b6 to block that threat. Queen to e4 centralizes the queen. Knight to d5 threatens the c3 pawn. So Firouzja plays c4. Now Svidler could just take the bishop here. Knight takes e3, rook takes e3. But after a move like f6 to defend e5, h4 is coming in a breakthrough after g5, just like a minority attack you see on the queen side in a Queen's Gambit exchange variation, except this is just on the king side, and Firouzja would break through and certainly win easily from that position. So Svidler, in an attempt to mix things up, plays the knight to c3, attacking the queen. The queen moves. Now e4, trying to open things up. Maybe he can get at this slightly, potentially vulnerable king at g1. The queen goes to f5, defending d3. After pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn. Rook to e8, and now rook to b3. And now we see the problem with Svidler's move, knight takes c3. His knight has a very hard time finding a place to go. He could play knight to a4, but the problem is after d4, the knight is frozen in place. He can't go anywhere. If he goes to b6, then c5 forks the knight and the queen. Otherwise, queen c6, c5, and the knight is just fixed in place, cannot move, and Firouzja has a clear, strong winning advantage. So instead, Svidler takes the pawn at a2, but now, after queen to a5, the knight is trapped. So Svidler, knowing he's going to lose his knight, tries to open things up as much as possible around Firouzja's king. Maybe there's some tactics, maybe there could be a perpetual, we'll see. f5, queen takes knight, fg4, continuing to try to open up that king a little bit more. c5, hits the queen, and also prepares a discovered check, which would be devastating. Svidler is forced to block that diagonal with queen to d5, but then rook to b2. And now the queens are forced off of the board because the queen pins the queen to the king. After queen a2, rook a2, Firouzja is simply left up a bishop in the endgame. After pawn takes h3, rook e to a1, the a7 pawn falls, and with it, the game. And at the end of this blitz game, Svidler resigned in this position, and Firouzja won a hard-fought battle. I hope you've enjoyed this game. I hope you've learned something from it as I have. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.